Every time something goes different than we would like, every time something kind of feels like it's working against us, every time something falls through, it has the potential to change us. Right? Those bumps that we experience actually affect us. And they can begin to drive the way that we react, where we are someone who's pushing back on others and being so upset all the time. Or just deciding that trying in life is just not worth it anymore. I just want to get up, do my thing, and go to sleep, and I'll just get through tomorrow again. And what it really comes down to is that when we experience all those things, we have to make a decision. We have to make a decision about how we're going to deal with the difficulties and bumps in our life. Because if we don't do that, they will decide for us how they affect us. And all those things we experience will begin to wear on us and tear us down. And a life that we had so much hope for becomes a life we're just trying to get through. And God has created you. He has created me to do more than just get through in this life. We're meant to thrive in this life. Now, thriving doesn't mean that everything is always easy. It doesn't mean that everything always works out. Right? But it does mean that you are created with a purpose, that I'm created with a purpose. And achieving that purpose sometimes means dealing with a lot of hassles and a lot of headaches and a lot of bumps and a lot of disappointment to get there. And if we're going to live the life that we are created to live, we've got to be willing to go through all that it takes to live out that life and not let it transform us into something that we don't want to be. So throughout this series, I want to look at how those things affect us and what we can do about it. And today I want to focus on one particular issue. I want to focus on this idea of staying heart healthy. Now, you've almost definitely heard that phrase before. You may have heard it in a Cheerios ad because it claims to be good food for you, which I'm not sure is actually true, but they say it is anyway. Right? But we think about being heart healthy in terms of our physical hearts. And if we think about our physical hearts, why do we take care of our physical hearts? Because it gives us a better life, right? If we take care of our physical hearts, that we know we have a fuller life, a richer life, hopefully a longer life. But when we talk about our hearts, we don't only use the word heart to talk about our physical heart, right? That we also have an emotional heart. And the question is, do we need to take care of that as well? Right, because our emotional heart, well, when we talk about something breaks my heart, right, that's something deeply important to us, right? That our emotional heart is kind of our inner self. In fact, I would argue that when we talk about something in our emotional heart, it's our truest self. So if we take care of our physical hearts, do we also need to take care of our emotional hearts? And I'm going to say yes, because if you don't, you're not going to have a rich, full life. You're not going to have the things in life that you could have. We're not going to do the things that we're able to do. Now, I know, as I was kind of working through this message, and I was thinking about this idea of, I've got to take care of my emotional heart and how I'm doing. And I'm thinking about, oh my goodness, I'm a 21st century man now. I cry in bed alone, sort of thing. That this is some new idea about, I'm not manly enough, that I'm just worried about my emotions and what do I do? But it's interesting that this idea of caring for our emotional selves is not a new idea. It's been around for thousands of years. Because in fact, if we go into the part of the Bible we call the Old Testament, the part that precedes the time of Jesus, there's a book in there that's a book of wisdom. It's called Proverbs. And Proverbs is very different than most of the other books in the Bible. Right? Some books in the Bible are narratives. Right? They're telling some kind of story about some set of events. Other books in the Bible are letters. Letters that one person writes to another church. Some of them are even kind of poems or songs. Right? That's what Psalms is. But Proverbs is simply a long series of statements of wisdom. And one of the statements in there it says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And this is written thousands of years ago, centuries before the time of Jesus. So this was something that was known long ago. That how well we care for ourselves emotionally, how well we care for what's going on inside of us, as this author says, how well you do that affects what everything you do afterwards is. And what I wanted to do this morning, before I kind of get into the rest of what I want to talk about, I want to kind of point out something that I like to reference often. That when we read the Bible, right, most of us read it in English. Does anybody here read ancient Hebrew, out of curiosity? Yeah. Probably not, right? I mean, there are people who do. I'm not one of them. But it's important to understand that the Bible was not written in English. No part of the Bible was written in English. So anything you read as an English-speaking person has been translated. And translations have an effect. And so that's one of the reasons that, like, when I'm preparing for a message, I read across several different translations to try to get what I believe is the clearest picture of what it's saying. And in most cases, to be clear, you know what? Read the Bible, read any translation you want, just read one. That's a good starting point. Because they're all good, they all do a good job, but sometimes there are details that are a little bit different because each English translation is translated with a different philosophy. Because translating from like ancient Hebrew to English is a very difficult task because there's no kind of word for word concept. Because, for example, the second part of this phrase, for everything you do flows from it, in Hebrew, that entire phrase, 3 words. Basically, the 3 words are, and I got to check my notes actually, the 3 words are for life flows. That's all it says. Above all else, guard your heart, for life flows. You good? It doesn't make sense for us, right? Because in Hebrew, there's a lot of kind of contextual referencing. You got to know what the author's leading towards. You got to kind of know what the author was trying to say. And so translators have to work all that kind of stuff out. And in this case, what we find is a meaningful statement, right? That above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. But I want to show you how another English translation translates this same statement. And this comes from what's called the New Living Translation. And one of the key things there is that the New Living Translation focuses very much on trying to capture the author's core thought, where the New International Version tries to balance kind of a literal translation along with an author's thought, trying to kind of tie those two things together. So the New Living Translation translates this same verse like this. It says, guard your heart above all else, not too big a difference, right? Just switches the order. But look at the second part. For it determines the course of your life. Now, both of those are accurate translations. Right? And they say fundamentally the same thing. Right? Take care of your emotional self, and it affects what happens afterwards. But in this case, the NLT, I think, captures this really core idea. Because something affecting what you do, well, that's important. But if something affects the entire course of your life, well, that's kind of a bigger deal. And I think that's what the author is going for. I mean, that's my opinion. Each translator believes that they're doing the best job, right? And again, they say fundamentally the same thing. But words matter. And words help us communicate the point we're trying to make here. And this is the thing that I want us to kind of grab onto this morning is that how well we care for our emotional selves will dictate everything that happens in our lives. I mean, think about things that you've done that you deeply regret. How many of those were driven by emotional pain or trying to compensate for something you think is wrong? Right? Excuse me, if we were healthy inside, we were healthy emotionally, we would have fewer of those incidents. And so the thing is that, you know, if I was to ask any of us, hey, is caring for yourself, caring for your emotional self, caring for your well-being, is that important? I think most of us would say yes. But then the question I would ask next is, well, how much time and energy do you put into caring for your well-being, caring for your emotional self? How much time do I spend on those things? I mean, do I spend time and energy caring for my emotional well-being as if the very course of my life depends on it? Do you? And I say all this, I don't want us to feel bad about ourselves. What I want us to do is to understand that this stuff is going on, and what we do really matters. Because one of the things that, we find in life is we can have really good intentions about things. But intentions don't do much. Do you know what does do much? Doing something, action. Right? There's a minister named Andy Stanley who I think captures this idea about the importance of where you end up. He makes this statement. He says, your direction, not your intention, determines your destination. You can intend to do wonderful things, but if you don't lead your life in a direction that heads there, it's not going to happen. If I open the hood of my car and intend to fix it, it's not going to go so well because I don't know what to do. I've got to do things that are consistent with fixing it. Well, in our lives, if we want our lives to land in a particular place, then we have to make the choice to do things that lead to that place. Not just intend to get there, but to actually lead a life consistent with that. And according to the author of Proverbs, if you want the course of your life to go well, if you want the course of my life to go well, then we have to care for our emotional well-being. So the question then is that how is your emotional well-being right now? Do you know? I mean, you probably have an opinion, but how can you tell how your emotional well-being is doing? How can I tell how my emotional well-being is doing? Is there some kind of barometer, some kind of test that I can perform to see how I'm doing inside? Well, interestingly, Jesus actually gives us a little bit of a barometer that we can use to see how we're doing. And this is one of the things that I enjoy so much as I read throughout the Bible, is that, the author of Proverbs makes a point, centuries before the time of Jesus, and then Jesus makes a statement centuries later that kind of ties them together. And so this idea of caring for our inner selves or guarding our hearts, as the author of Proverbs says, here's where Jesus gives us some insight so we can see, well, what is the condition of our heart? And are we guarding it very well? Jesus makes this statement. He says, a good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart. An evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. Okay, so Jesus is saying that, what we produce reflects what's in our heart. But how do we measure that? And this is the key. This is the point. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. Jesus says, you want to know how your heart's doing? You want to know how your emotional well-being is doing? Listen to the words that you use. Listen to the things you say to people. Listen to the things you say to people that you're not required to be nice to. Listen to the things you say about people when you don't think they're going to know what you said. He says that reflects what's going on inside of your heart. And so, please don't answer this out loud, but if you think through all the things you've said over the past week, to people, about people, people you were upset with, people who let you down, that cashier that was just taking so long to ring you up as you were leaving the grocery store, was everything you said positive? 100% of the time? Mine wasn't. Particularly the cashier at the grocery store. But anyway. Because it's clearly all her fault, by the way. It's all her fault that I arrived late, didn't give myself enough time and get everything together. That's entirely her fault, right? Right, but the thing is, what it really comes down to is that when we reflect on the things we say, and we realize that we often say things that maybe we regret, or maybe we should regret, whether we do or not, or we say things that we should apologize for. If we find ourselves doing that, that indicates something is going on. And I think the other one that we have to be so aware of is this idea of talking about people. right? That if we think they're not going to know what we said, oh my goodness, the things we will say. You know, if someone heard everything you said about them when you thought no one was listening, how would you feel if they found that out? You know, if I'm having struggles in my life, and kind of like my grocery store example, if I start making mistakes in my life and I start blaming other people for them, what does that say about my emotional well-being? What does that say about how well I'm guarding my heart? And one of the things that we want to really be mindful of is that when we have one of those cases where maybe we lose our temper and we just blow up and we just say something, and as soon as we get done saying it, we're like, boy, I hope I still have a job, sort of thing. What do we say right away? Oh, that's not me. You know, it was just a situation. I just got emotional. I mean, how many times have you heard a public figure go, oh, I said and did these horrible things, but that's not me because I got caught. That's not me. But Jesus says, no, that's not accurate. Jesus says, the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. That when we say those things, it is in there. It didn't manufacture in the ether. It came up from our hearts. It came up from our emotions. It came up from our well-being, not being well, right, sort of thing. Right? That's what Jesus wants us to understand. That when we say things like that, we are not protecting our hearts well enough. We are not doing the work to make sure that we are connected with God, that we are staying healthy, that our relationships are healthy. You know, it could be many different things, right? That we can undermine our well-being by simply working too much, right? All kinds of things can undermine our well-being, you know, to much more serious things that we might be doing. But all of those things collectively impact our well-being. And so the thing that I want us to do is to say, hey, maybe each of us could just take a little bit of time to see how well our emotional hearts are doing. I mean, if you have a physical issue, right? If you have an issue with your physical heart, what do? You get a checkup, right? And so in the case of our physical hearts, you know, someone might, take your pulse, might check your blood pressure. If there's something more serious going on, they might ask for a stress test, right? That's how you do a checkup on your physical heart. So how do we do the same sort of thing on our emotional hearts? How do we do the same sort of thing for our well-beings? Because in order to guard our hearts, we need to know a few things. We need to have a general idea of what the condition of our emotional heart is, what's the condition of our well-being, and we want to understand why that's the case. So the thing I want to do in the few minutes we have left this morning is to kind of give us a framework so we can do a self-exam. So we can actually kind of walk through and begin to understand, how are we doing inside? How emotionally healthy are we? How connected and in touch with things and ourselves are we? So what I'd like to do is kind of give you a few questions to ask yourself. And what I want you to do is, like, just like you go to the doctor when you know you're sick, I want you to look for evidence that you might be sick. And in this case, the evidence that we might be sick is what? The things we say. So the next time you say something to someone, you're like, whoa, that was way harsher than I meant for it to be, or wow, I really shouldn't have said that. Or you realize that you're talking really badly about someone behind their backs. The next time you do that, you go, wow, Jesus said that's an indication that my heart might be a little bit sick. I want you to ask yourself these 4 questions. So when you do or say the thing, right, when you talk about someone or you say something to someone, the first question I want you to ask yourself, what triggered me to say that? And when I ask that question, what I mean by that is, what is the external factor that caused you to make that statement, or make that statement the way that you did? Was it that you were, time was short and it was running out and the person in front of you just wasn't moving quickly enough? Was it a stressful environment? That sort of thing. Whatever the thing is that triggered you. Is it a person that, man, you just don't like? What was that external factor? And the reason I start there is that because I think that's the place we tend to automatically go. Oh, the problem is them. The problem is the time. The problem was the traffic. And that is an external trigger, but that's not the cause of the problem. Because once we identify the external factor, I would like to invite us to redirect the question from the external, where do you think I'm going to go? Internal. So now say, well, what's going on inside my heart that led me to say that? What was I feeling? Was I already angry? Was I already sad? Was I just hyper-focused on something else? Right? But what was I feeling inside at the moment I said those words? What was the feeling inside me that was going on? And then I want to get to the next question, which is really the big one. Why is that feeling inside my heart? Why was I so amped up? Why was it a time where I've dealt with this person 1,000 times, but 1,001 was just too many? What was going on inside me? You know, is it something you have going on in your life? You know, again, something like working too much wears us out, and that can affect us. If you're not sleeping enough, those things can do it. But also there are a lot of other things that factor into that, right? If we're not sleeping enough because we're staying up all night watching cable news because we're all freaked out, well, that's going to affect you. The problem there is not that you're not sleeping enough. The problem there is that you're doing what? Watching too much cable news or reading too much social media, right? All these things that are designed to make us fearful and angry and feel like people are stealing from us, convincing us that the world looks a certain way, whether it does or not. You know, and there are other things, people I know who are like, well, he's usually a nice guy, but he gets a couple drinks and he's not such a nice guy anymore. And what if that's you? You know, or taking medication prescribed or otherwise. And that's when those things keep happening. Right? Understanding the source of what's eroding our well-being. And the list is huge. But you know what it is for you if you'll face it. And that's a big part of this, is that this idea of guarding our hearts, it requires something that is really hard to do. Be honest with yourself. Doing an objective, honest evaluation of ourselves is incredibly difficult because we want to cut ourselves breaks, right, all the time. You know, that somebody does a particular thing and that's because they're an idiot. But when I do that thing, that's because I had an excuse. Right? And what we need to do is practice self-honesty. And I truly believe the most effective way to do that is to write out your answer to this particular question. You know, get a piece of scrap paper, get a journal, whatever works for you, and really write out, like, why is that in there? And be really honest with yourself. You know, and once you write it out, you can do with it what you want. I mean, some people like to kind of hang on to it and kind of reread it. Other people just burn it. Because they've faced it, now they can kind of let go of it a little bit. But the idea is to actually process in our minds, man, why am I so uptight? Why am I losing my patience so quickly? Why do I keep talking to people this way? Why do I feel elevated when I put other people down? What's going on inside me that's doing all that? And then once we do that, there's one last question. What am I going to do to guard my heart? What am I going to do to deal with it, right? Just identifying the source of the issue is really important. But if you only intend to address the problem, but never do, it doesn't get any better. We have to not just intend to address the issue, but actually address the issue. You know, so again, if you're not getting enough sleep because you're consuming too much media, social, cable news, whatever, stop doing that. Which sounds so easy, but I know for many of you, that's not easy. I mean, I'm a news junkie, man. But I had to, I just couldn't take it anymore. I had to let go of it. Because I was just angry all the time. And not productive anger, because there really isn't much productive anger, actually. Right? But what is it for you? You know, if you have a tendency to lose your temper more after a couple drinks, well, it's only a couple drinks. Well, not everyone can have a couple drinks. Is your relationship with your family more important than a couple drinks? You know, if we're working too much, and you're like, well, I got to make the money. But there's balance. Right? Of course we have to earn a living. You know, I've confessed my overworking to you guys many times. And when I finally backed off, shockingly, still found a way to make things work. Okay, maybe there's a few things I would have bought that I couldn't. I'd rather have a good relationship with my wife. Right? These are the things that we have to be willing to do. And it's worth it, right? It's actually worth it, because my fear is, as I say all this, we hear it as a subtractive mindset. Oh, I've got to get rid of these things. I've got to take these things out. But no, see it as a constructive mindset. Because where do you want to be? Those things that hold on to us hold us back. And we're never going to get to where we want to be. Which is why, above all else, guard your heart, for the very direction of your life depends on it. No matter what age you are, no matter what stage of life you are in, that if you will address these things, you will see that it will free you. But it's only going to happen if you explicitly do it, choose to do it, not just intend to do it, but do it, and walk it all the way out. And you will begin to live in the fullness of life that God extends to you and allowing you to thrive. But when we don't do it, we are choosing to not thrive. And God wants you to thrive in this life and do the things He's created you to do.